Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and if you love theater, as I do, then I'm sure you appreciate the marvelous artistic talent of those who can stand on a stage and make virtual magic by entertaining us, making us laugh, making us cry, and even inspiring us with their extraordinary performances. And on this edition of L'Chaim, I have the pleasure of introducing you to an extraordinary individual and entertainer who's worked his magic on stage, in film, in Yiddish, in English. Avi Hoffman, who's thrilled audiences virtually his entire life from the age of 10 when he was featured in a folk-screener production of Bronx Express here in New York. And Avi is currently starring in a marvelous show of song and memories entitled Still Jewish After All These Years, a Meshuggah's life in the theater. Let me tell you a little bit about Avi Hoffman. Many of you may have seen him in his hit one-man shows here in New York, Too Jewish and Too Jewish Too, for which he was named Performer of the Year by New York Press Magazine and received the Ovation Award for Best Actor in a Musical in Los Angeles. Avi's appeared in countless stage productions. He's played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. He was in Favish Finkel's Follies. If you've seen the film The Imported Bridegroom here on Shalom TV, it stars Avi Hoffman. And it's not only on stage. He's been a lead singer with a klezmer orchestra, singing on national television, singing at Avery Fisher Hall, has been on 2 major European tours. And behind the scenes, he's been a most successful director and served as the artistic director of the Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater. And Avi Hoffman, first of all, it's lovely. It's wonderful that you're back in New York. It's wonderful that you're doing Still Jewish after all these years. Thank you for spending a moment with us.
Thank you, Ma. I laughed. I cried already just from your introduction.
I want to talk a little bit about you, then I want to talk about the show.
Okay.
Okay. So I mentioned that, when you look at your biography, lo and behold, you started at 10.
I started at birth.
At birth?
Yes.
You were born with what?
I was
what
born to an audience of 25 medical students who were learning how to perform a cesarean section at the Royal Hospital on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx.
Amazing.
And they took me out, they showed me to the medical students, they applauded, and I took my first bow.
That's a fabulous story. Tell me about your parents.
My parents are both Holocaust survivors. My father, Oliver Sholem, passed away in 2001. He was Hungarian, Czechoslovakian on the border, on the Carpathian Mountains, tiny little shtetl called Apshice. And he and his family and his entire village was basically destroyed by the Nazis in Auschwitz. And so that was a huge influence on my life, obviously. My mother had a little bit of a different story. She was born in a slave labor camp in Siberia. And they were originally, my grandparents were from Lodz, Poland. And after the war, they were able to escape the regime, the Russian Gulag, and ended up in a DP camp in Germany, in Ulm. And from Ulm, they came to America. My parents met here, and they both dedicated their lives to the preservation of the Jewish culture in general, and the Yiddish language in particular.
What were their names?
Mendel Hoffman, Oliver Sholem, and Miriam Hoffman, who is still very active. She is the professor of the Yiddish language at Columbia University.
Really?
And has been for the past 25 years.
How old is she?
She's 77 and still going strong.
That is wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
You said that it had a profound influence on your life, on you, that your parents were both Holocaust survivors, or more that your father's experience?
Well, my father was really, the survivor in the classic sense of the word. My mother survived the war. A slave labor camp in Siberia isn't exactly the Bahamas. And so, in the DP camp was a very profound experience for her. You know, I think that my upbringing was very unique in the sense that we were one of the last of the Mohicans, so to speak. I grew up in a very Yiddish-oriented area in the Bronx. And there were several families, many of whom are still around today and still very active in that particular world. The Malotics. Zalman Malotic, of course, is the artistic director of the Volksbühne. The Schechters. Ben Schechter is involved in Yiddish and the chorus, and he was my original music director on Too Jewish. The Gottliebs, the Fishmans, the Gottesmans, all of whom have stayed. The Waletskis, Josh Waletsky, of course, is very well known in the documentary film world. We were this little enclave on Bainbridge Avenue in the Bronx who really were committed to the Yiddish language. And that was my upbringing. So by the time I was 4 years old, I was actually performing Yiddish shows at the Sholem Aleichem Volksschule. Yiddish was my first language. I didn't speak English until I went to public school. And so that was, you know, and the Holocaust was something that was an integral part of our upbringing. Even though my father never really spoke about his experiences in the camp, as so many survivors don't, eventually I did hear the story from him, actually on his deathbed. And I talk about that in my show. It was something that was always there. The Holocaust was always present, and it was a profound, just knowing that it happened, and that it happened to our parents and our grandparents, was a very profound part of who I am, and became a very strong part of who I am. And not that it permeates everything, of course, but there is a very, there's a sadness behind the laughter.
When you talk about the extent to which the Holocaust permeated your early life, was there a sadness in your home?
Look, the short answer is yes. The long answer is a lot more complicated. My father, you know, God bless his soul, was a loving individual who was adored by all who knew him. And he laughed a lot. He was a happy man and a kind man and a compassionate man. But when I looked in his eyes, I saw the sadness of what he had lost and what he had experienced. And it's interesting that people have said the same thing to me over the years, that when they look in my eyes, there is a sadness behind the joy. And I think that is maybe the Jewish experience for thousands of years. You know, part of being Jewish is having it in our genes that for thousands of years we have found the joy in our sadness and always found a way to overcome the terror, to overcome the sadness, to overcome the persecution, and still go on. And I try to bring that sense of joy and compassion into everything that I do.
Were you an only child?
No, I was. My brother was also an only child. I was an only child until the age of 12. And then my parents moved to Israel when I was 11. And when I was 12, my brother was actually born in Israel. And so he's much younger than I am. By the time he was, 5, I was pretty much out of the house. And so I was an only child in many respects, as he was.
That's interesting. You know, over the years, the age gap narrows.
Yes, of course.
Are you close to him now?
Not as close as I would like, but, we each have some very interesting challenges that we have to deal with.
Did you love your father?
Absolutely.
Was it hard for you as a son to see the sadness in his eyes, which, by the way, my guess is people who knew him well may have seen it, but people who did not know him well may not have seen it. But you did see it.
Yes.
Was it hard on you?
Yeah, yes. I had a wonderful childhood, and I was a very happy child. And I think part of that joy and the fact that my mother was 10 years younger than my dad, and her life was music and poetry and song and theater. And so that was so much a part of my life. But as I said earlier, I mean, I think I always knew, and especially in light of the fact that every year, although we were not religious in the classic sense of the word, our religion was the Jewish culture. That was our religion, and the Yiddish language. And we celebrated all the holidays. And so every holiday had its sadness, or for the most part. You know, and especially Passover, because in our Passover celebration, we celebrated the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And Zog nicht keinmal as du gehst dem letzten Weg, and the reading of the poetry that came out of the Warsaw Ghetto.
We should remind people that the Warsaw Ghetto was attacked by the Nazis, the final attempt to liquidate. It was during Pesach, during the holiday of Passover.
That's right.
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 So for your father, Passover had this overlay of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto.
Correct.
And the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so,
and to this day,
your
when
Seder,
I celebrate Passover with my family, we do celebrate that part of the Passover experience.
And you have a reading that relates to this?
Oh yes, yes.
Which reading?
There is a poem, and now of course it's eluding me, the name of it, but it is a very long poem about the Passover Warsaw experience, and of course the song that goes with it.
So it's interesting, as your family celebrated, you know, this, what very often is the salvation of the Jewish people, the rescue of the Jewish people, the redemption of the Jewish people through God's bringing them out of Egypt and bringing us across the Red Sea, and then we go to Sinai. For your family, there was an overlay which those Jews who did not experience the Holocaust, and many American Jews were detached from it. It was a different kind of experience for you than is typical at a Seder, yes?
Absolutely. No, our Seder was Yiddish. It was a Yiddish Seder.
Yiddish Haggadah?
Yes, a Yiddish Haggadah from the Shalom Aleichem Institute. We still had the Hebrew sections, but we also had the Yiddish sections. You know, Chad Gadyo was in Yiddish.
Yes.
You know, I mean, we sang all the songs basically in Yiddish as well. And so to this day, as I said, I try to celebrate with my family and all of our guests. My Seders are usually anywhere from 25 to 35 people. But just to get back to your original question, I saw the sadness in my father, but I also saw how he overcame it. I also saw how he conquered it. And so that, to me, was a very large part of my upbringing, which was conquering the sadness, being able to get past the sadness, never to forget it, but to always be able to get past it.
Did I also understand you to say that your father had trouble talking about it till the end of his life?
Yes, yes.
Just sort of muse on that for a moment. Why do you think that was, and why, at the end of his life, did he want to talk about it?
It's not uncommon for Holocaust survivors to not speak of their experiences. There are those who came out of the experience wanting to share, and I think primarily as they get older, I have done many projects that are Holocaust related, and we could do a whole show on a project I'm working on right now called the Dachau album project, but I won't expound on that now. But I've experienced many different projects where Holocaust survivors, as they get older, find the need to share their experiences, primarily with young students, many of whom are not Jewish. And I find it profoundly sad that so many young people today, Jews, unfortunately, and especially non-Jews, of course, who have no relationship to the experience, who, when asked about the Holocaust, seem to think that it's ancient history. I've produced shows for young audiences that are Holocaust-related, and before the production, I always go out and do a Q&A with the young people, and I say, when did the Holocaust happen? And young kids from the inner city will say, 600 years ago, 800, 1,000 years ago. They don't know. And that saddens me and actually propels me to do more in this field. Because as we know, when we forget, we are destined to repeat. And so I have actually made it a great part of my career, a great part of my experience, and a great part of my commitment to my life and to my father's memory to work on projects that are Holocaust-related, both for young people and older people, and find a way to bridge those generations.
Avi, you are part of the generation that's called the second generation.
Yes.
Sometimes it's also difficult for members of the second generation to, and I'm going to use a horrible word, have a normal life. There's no such thing as a normal. You and I know that, Avi. There's no but you also know what they mean by that. That there is an overlay, a burden that the second generation sometimes carries. They can be very, very much worried for their parents. Sometimes parents have not been able to transcend as your father was, and the sadness is all pervasive, and it even becomes sometimes harsh for the children. As you look at your own life, and again, you've had a successful professional career, but I'm not asking about that now. Have there been times in which you have been handicapped by being a member of the second generation?
Yes. That's the short answer. It's a very interesting thing, and although so many Jews joke about therapy being such a big part of being Jewish, I have had to share my thoughts with others, not extensively, but there have been times in my life. I think the biggest lesson I learned just about this second generation question, and the Holocaust question, interestingly enough, is related to that, specifically for me, of course. God, everybody's going to think this is such a serious thing. This is a comedy, just so you know. It's actually really funny.
Yeah, I promise
we'll
get
talk
to it.
about that later.
I promise we'll get to it.
I think the biggest lesson that I had to learn about the second generation question is that we are all entitled to our tragedies. We're all entitled to... It took me a long time to grasp the fact that I had things in my life that were not good. And I always used to think, well, how dare I be upset by the fact that my first wife and I had to get divorced. How could I be upset by that? I wasn't in Auschwitz. I was born in America. I'm privileged. I'm first generation American, second generation. How dare I, feel bad about the fact that I'm having trouble getting work or paying the bills? I have food on the table. I wasn't tortured by the Nazis. This was a very big thing for me to get over, to actually allow myself to accept the fact that my problems are mine, and I'm entitled to them. And that was a big thing. And so that, to me, I think, was the biggest hurdle to overcome. But still, normal is such a relative term, isn't it? I like to think that I am actually quite normal, and our family life is quite normal, and my children, God bless them, are quite normal, in spite of the fact that we are in the theater. My wife and I are both actors. My children have chosen paths that have taken them into the arts. My daughter is a brilliant actress in her own right, who's now studying at the Atlantic Acting School here in New York. But she's already made movies and done shows and had a wonderful, really extraordinary career by the age of 18. My younger daughter has found a path in music. She loves the French horn and the piano and has excelled as a 15-year-old. But in spite of the fact that we are in the arts, which most people look at and go, oh God, they're not normal. Frankly, I look at most of my children's friends who are children of accountants and lawyers and whatever, professional, doctors or orthodontists or whatever, and I see a terrible dysfunction. And I think I attribute our normalcy in a way to the fact that I am a second generation rather than third or fourth or fifth. Because I think I am still attached with that umbilical cord to the old world and to the old experience and the joy of being a first generation American. I don't take for granted for a moment the extraordinary opportunity and freedom that we have here in America. And I think that part of the tragedy of the American Jewish experience, and I say tragedy for a reason, is that although we have come to enjoy a wonderful sense of freedom and a wonderful sense of our place in the American society, we are certainly highly respected and we've reached the highest levels of society, government, politics, professional life, money. We have lost something. If you ask young Jews today who Isaac Bashevis Singer was, they will look at you with a blank stare. And not just young people, even people my age. If you ask them who Sholem Aleichem was, or Peretz, or Chaim Potok, or Chaim Grade, or any of the great writers, composers, songwriters, theatrical, playwrights, they don't know. And that, to me, is the great tragedy of the Jewish American experience, is that in 1 or 2 generations, we have lost, maybe, God, I don't want to sound so harsh, but we have lost a great part of our soul. Because for 1,000 years, the culture, in addition to the religion, they went hand in hand. And now we have the faith, for the most part, although I think I just saw a poll that came out 2 days ago that said 27 or 28% of the Jewish people polled said they really have no attachment to the religion whatsoever. And so a quarter of our people has no attachment to the religion. The 75% that may have an attachment to the religion, I would say a vast part of those, it's peripheral. But yet we've lost the other half of that equation, which is that enormous sense of the rich and deep culture that kept us going for 1,000 years. Certainly the Yiddish culture for 1,000 years, and the Hebrew, and all of that came before that for 5,000 years. And so I find that to be tragic. And because of being second generation, I am still attached to that in a very strong way. And all the work that I do, whether it was Too Jewish or Too Jewish Too, or still Jewish after all these years, but more than that, all the shows, many of the shows that I work on, are attached to that culture that is being slowly eroded and lost from the Jewish experience. Yes, we have Jerry Seinfeld. Yes, we have Woody Allen. Yes, we have Larry David. It's interesting. In the Jewish Week, in the review that was written up in the Jewish Week, in the article, it said that somehow I have found a way to reattach the Jerry Seinfeld experience of Judaism into my experience of Judaism for a new generation. And I hope that that's true. I would love to be able to say that young Jews can come to my show and walk out having experienced it from a new, modern perspective, but reattached to an older world that has been lost.
Mm-hmm. One more question on this line.
Sure.
There will come a time, and it will not be too long from now, when there will be no survivors left.
Yes.
The second generation will be the only thing left.
Well, and then the third generation and the
The
fourth
third generation will not be the same. It's not the same when you're the grandchild of a survivor.
Correct.
Do you worry about, you talk about, I say the same thing, there's the Civil War and the Holocaust, didn't they happen at the same time? Meaning that it's all ancient history.
Right.
When I don't know if you ever give it thought, but I'm asking you to give it thought now. What happens to the reality, the fact that this was a shaping experience in modern Jewish history? Contemporary Jewish history is shaped by that. Many people don't understand that in the Jewish psyche, so much of our reaction to anything that goes on in the world is in some way colored by the fact that there was a Holocaust.
Yes.
And I also have to say, and I'm not going to spend time on this, but I'm making just a general comment. You can agree or not agree. It's an aside. Many people have tragedies. Peoples have tragedies.
Sure.
And there are many times humanity is inhuman to other humans.
Yes.
The Holocaust, however, was a unique historic
Absolutely,
event.
I agree.
And it is our event.
And I'm offended.
At some point,
I'm offended when people use the word Holocaust.
I am too.
As if it were.
That's correct. And this is not to minimize their suffering.
Of course not.
It's not about the pain.
Of course not.
It is about understanding how the Jew did nothing but exist. As Elie Wiesel said, the crime was being. Very rarely is the crime the being, and then there was an intensity and a sadism to it that is beyond human comprehension. It's not just that people died.
Right.
Okay. And that shapes Jewish life today still. Mm-hmm. And at some point, it will, it'll be history. Avi, what's that going to mean for Jewish life?
I mean, it's very interesting that you asked me this question because I'm actually directing a documentary film at the moment. I wasn't going to talk about this.
Oh, talk about it for a moment. This is the Dachau?
The Dachau album project. I'm directing a documentary film at the moment which exactly deals with the question you're asking. And I put it in exactly those terms, that the word Holocaust is used today to, the word Nazi. You're a soup Nazi. No soup for you! Suddenly anybody is a Nazi. If you don't agree with me, you're a Nazi. Glenn Beck is a Nazi. Obama is a Nazi. Bush was a Nazi. Everybody's a Nazi. The Holocaust is used as if it were pop culture. And I am offended by that. And this artifact that I am the national director of is an album that is quite substantial and perhaps one of the most important discoveries since World War II. It's been sitting in a closet for 65 years. And the woman whose father brought it to America in 1947 was a Jewish teenager at the end of the war. He stayed in Dachau for 2 years after the war, working as an office boy for the American officers who were running the camp. In 1947, he comes to America with this album, puts it in the closet, has a life, marries an American woman, gets a degree, becomes an engineer, has 4 children, lives what seems to be an American success story, and then in 1972 he commits suicide. His wife dies a year later, and the children wander off to relatives, and this album ends up in this woman's closet for the next 40 years, until she meets me. She shows me this album, and I realize immediately the importance of it. I call Holocaust experts worldwide to come and look at it. And then we go to Germany, we go to Dachau, we go to the ITS in Bad Arolsen, the International Tracing Service, and we find out everything we can about not only the young Jewish boy, but here's what's going to blow your mind. There are 30 pieces of artwork in the album that were, we've since discovered, created by a prisoner in Dachau who was a Catholic from Warsaw, who was also interred in Dachau, survived the war. We don't know how his artwork ended up in this young Jewish boy's album, but it is the most extraordinary series of artwork discovered since the war, because it tells a sequential narrative, a documentary of life and death in the concentration camp known as Dachau. This Catholic ended up moving to Australia, coming back to Europe, and dying alone and penniless in England in 1989. The story of this album is beyond comprehension.
It's fantastic.
But the reason I bring it up in this context is that since the end of World War II, the Holocaust has been identified primarily, and I want to say this in the nicest way, as a Jewish experience. And I think as we start to lose the survivors, we need to now understand that although the Holocaust and the genocide of the Jews as part of the Holocaust was a Jewish experience, when we really look at the numbers, and again, when you ask someone, how many people died in the Holocaust? They say 6 million Jews. Well, there were 53 million people, human beings, who lost their lives in World War II. Catholics, homosexuals, gypsies, the disabled, soldiers, men, women, children. And this Catholic artist has given us a new tool by which to expand the experience that we call the Holocaust beyond the Jewish experience into the world of Christianity, into the world of the general population. And I think that, to answer your question in a very long way, is what will allow us, the second generation, the children of the survivors, and ultimately the grandchildren and all those who come beyond, to be able to take this experience that we call the Holocaust and relate it in an artistic fashion, and the stories of these two particular, one Catholic, one Jew, to bring it out to the general population for generations to come. The Library of Congress has requested that this album become part of their collection, and we are now working towards that. The Archdiocese of the United States of America, and I have met personally with the archbishops in Washington and Miami, have all said that this must become an exhibition that goes to the Vatican. And so we now have an opportunity through this Dachau album project to create not only exhibitions that will travel worldwide, but also academic materials that can teach people, young people from kindergarten up to doctoral theses, a way to expand upon this experience that will continue for generations to come. And I believe that there will be theater and film, and there is already. And thank God for Steven Spielberg, who came up with this idea to interview these survivors before they die. My father did one of the interviews, and that's how I learned so many of his stories that I didn't know, that he never talked about. And so I think we now will be able to, and hopefully I can be an important part of this as we bring the experience into the 21st generation and beyond. And it is truly, and I hope maybe someday we'll do an interview dedicated just to that. as the documentary film goes farther and all these projects start to gain some ground.
First of all, how lucky it was that you were the one who, in essence, found it through this woman.
Yeah, I feel
And I think
privileged.
what you've done is extraordinary, and we will absolutely, you must stay in touch with me, and at
I
any
shall.
given point you think it's appropriate, then we talk about this. But that's an incredible, incredible story and wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, so now segue with me. You know, you've heard, there is the...
It's a comedy, I promise. It's funny. No, go ahead.
So there is the classic image of the clown, who, while he is happy on the outside, right, is crying on the inside. The sad clown.
Right.
And I have to, I'm thinking to myself, you've said two things to me that struck me. On the one hand, you said, I had a very happy childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And you grew up for the first 10, 11 years in the Bronx, then you ended up in Israel. For how long are you in
Correct.
Israel?
9 years.
Was that a good time for
The
you?
greatest.
Where did you live
The
in
great
Israel?
Herzliya.
Oh, you lived in a great place, right? You learned to speak fluent Hebrew,
Immediately.
and you felt at home with other kids your age.
Absolutely.
And it was a wonderful Jewish experience as well. What I mean by Jewish is, I do not mean religious. I
Yes.
mean, do you come away feeling a tie to the Israeli/Jewish people because of it?
Sure, of course. You can't help it because the history is there. Israel is history. Israel is 5,000 years of, there's Mount Sinai. We went to Mount Sinai. I went to one of the most prestigious high schools in Israel, the Gymnasium Herzliya in Tel Aviv, the first high school in Tel Aviv, before Tel Aviv was a city. I think the first high school in Israel. So we were obviously very privileged to be able to go to Jerusalem and to Mount Sinai. I mean, I lived
Oh, you
there.
didn't go
It
to Mount
was
Sinai,
there.
did you?
Oh, yes.
Okay, but just
When
so
the
our audience,
Sinai-
just make sure our audience understands, Sinai is not in Israel proper.
No, now it's in the peninsula, but
right.
that was part of Israel after the Six-Day War. So I used to hang out in the Sinai Peninsula all the time, Nueba, Dahab, and
No kidding.
oh sure, oh yeah, all the time. I have pictures
You
of a
hung
class
out?
trip.
Who
Yeah,
did you hang
yeah.
out with?
Bedouins.
Really?
Oh yeah.
How did you
yeah.
get down there?
Car. We drove.
And who's we?
Oh, friends. We used to have.
So your
these-
age group just
I
got
was
in
a
the car?
teenager. I mean,
and that's
I was
what
a
teenagers
crazy
did?
teenager, long hair. I was
Really?
a wild kid. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah.
A
yeah.
hippie of sorts?
I was.
You were an Israeli hippie?
I was.
Okay. But did I sense that you didn't want to say something positive initially?
No,
In other words,
no,
when
no.
I said to you,
It's interesting. The Jewish aspect of Israel is inherent in being there, but it's not something that anybody talks about on a daily basis. Yeah, on Friday night the buses stopped driving. On holidays everybody went to the shul.
Okay.
Even me.
okay. Even you.
Even me, for the most part. But Jewishness was just kind of there.
Yes,
it wasn't
okay. I appreciate what you're saying. I
a
hope
Jewish experience in the sense that we
absolutely.
sat around going, well, we're Jews. It
No,
was just
no,
we
abs-
were.
right.
It wasn't discussed,
Yes,
really.
and that's one of the greatest things about the state of Israel,
Yes,
right?
but we studied the Torah, we studied the Talmud, I mean, that was part of our education.
Okay. But anyway,
So in
your
that
childhood
sense,
was a
yes.
good childhood.
Great childhood.
First in the United States, then
Israel
in
was
Israel.
even greater, yes.
And lo and behold, you were a happy kid.
Yes.
Okay. And yet at the same time, there is this overlay because you are also sensitive to who your father was and his past, etc. So I want to know from you, first of all, when do you find out you're funny? And second, is any of this the sad clown? Is there any sad clown in you?
Oh, sure, of course. When did I find out I was funny? When my mother started laughing at things that I did and said. So from the time I was, 2 years old, I was entertaining. I would get up and sing, and people would applaud and laugh, and it was great.
And you loved it.
I loved it. When I was 4 years old, my mother wrote my first show for me to perform in Yiddish at the shul, at the Shalom Aleichem Volksschule. It was called Aleph Avremel. Aleph Avremel ist gegangen in den Wald, Beis hat a Bär in der Seen, dorten bald. And the bear says, nyam, 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 Avremel. And I talk about this in the show, because this show is about my career, my Meshugana life in the theater, which started when I was born and takes me to this day. And so, yes, the laughter was always there. Sholem Aleichem was funny. You know, I mean, the stories, the comedians, you know, Menashe Skolnick is one of the funniest people that ever lived in the Jewish experience. And so I do, you know, I was able to discover at a very young age the joy of the Jewish comedy, the joy of laughing at our troubles in order to overcome them. And so the vast majority of my work is funny. And I find the humor in everything that I try to do, unless and until it deals with how serious, the serious side of that comedy. And then it becomes very moving. And yet I always find the smile. No matter how terrible the stories I may be telling, there is always a smile somewhere, eventually. But, you know, by the time I was 8, I played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof at the community center in the Bronx. And I have the recording of that, which is in the show, where my mother recorded me, and there I am, 8-year-old Zero Mostel with a Bronx accent. Dear God, you made many, many poor people. I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. I mean, that was me at 8. By 10, I was in the professional Yiddish theater, doing these, you know, Yiddish melodramas. And interestingly enough, talk about laughter, my first New York Times review said, Avi Hoffman displays a sense of humor.
Yes.
And so there I was at 10 already finding the humor. One thing always led to another. I would do one show, and that's when I got the call. Somebody had heard about me, and they called me up and said, do you want to be involved in this project? Well, that led me to a show called The Golden Land. And The Golden Land was one of the great hits of the early 80s where...
Again, done by Folksbiene Theater.
No, actually, it wasn't. It was done by the Folksbiene last year.
Yes.
But at the time, it was actually produced by Zalman Malotic and Moshe
Yes.
Rosenfeld, Art DeLugoff, who ran the
And
Village
where did it
Gate.
play?
It played at the Norman Thomas High School first, and then it traveled all over the America, Philadelphia.
Did you travel with it?
Oh, yes. I did the show for 4 years, hundreds and hundreds of performances. I performed at the Kennedy Center for Ronald Reagan. I mean, truly, it was an extraordinary experience.
By the way, it is the arc of the Yiddish experience in America.
The immigrant experience
Right.
from the 1880s to the 1940s.
That's what the Golden Land's about.
That was the Golden Land.
A wonderful show.
An extraordinary show.
Yeah.
And I was privileged to be one of the original cast members with Bruce Adler, Oliver Sholem, who passed away.
Who was a wonderful
and,
actor.
you know, just
I
amazing.
get chills. It's amazing.
And what made it so unique, I mean, in my show, I talk about it as the first modern revolution in the Yiddish theater, because it was young people doing old material in a new way. And it was enormously successful for its time.
And I forget, who was the... Malotek was part of it.
Yeah, Malotic
But
and
who was the
Moshe
writer?
Rosenfeld
Moshe
compiled the
Rosenfeld.
material.
Terrific production.
I mean, it wasn't original in the sense that the material that we performed was all known material.
But it was the way it was
But the
interwoven.
way it was put together
Right.
was new and contemporary for its time. So that show then led, you know, to the fact that I got the call. and they were doing a world premiere of a show called The Rise of David Levinsky. And that was all English, all new, and based on Abraham Kahan's great novel, The Rise of David Levinsky, from 1917. And that, too, was about this immigrant experience, but in a very new and different way. And I ended up getting the starring role in that show off-Broadway. It became the biggest off-Broadway production of its time. That then led to more and more shows, and so many of them Jewish-oriented that I kind of became known as the go-to Jew. Anybody needed a Jew, I got the call. And eventually, my mother and I worked on a project that she had written that I believe became the second modern revolution in Yiddish theater, called Songs of Paradise, that was picked up by Joseph Papp and performed at the Public Theater and became a huge hit in its time.
Wasn't that thrilling for you?
Oh, God, yes. Oh, yes. And again, this is the arc of my show. You know, it just kind of went from one show to the next. And every time I thought, okay, I'm going to be a star now. This is it. And then something would happen and it would not. And eventually I became too Jewish.
Did you become too Jewish?
Well, that was the perception in the industry.
Now you did 2 shows, Too Jewish,
yes,
right?
And
Too Jewish too.
T-O-O also.
Jewish.
Yes, Too Jewish also.
A fabulous thing.
Before I wrote Too Jewish, I had become too Jewish for the New York theater industry. And I was having trouble getting work. And so in 1994, I found myself in desperate straits. My wife was pregnant with our first child. I didn't have any money. I couldn't get a job. My credit cards were maxed out. And I went to a friend who was a producer, and he said, write a show. And I wrote Too Jewish. Avi Hoffman's Too Jewish?
It's with a question mark.
With a question mark.
Right.
Why was I too Jewish? I was trying to figure it out. And that show became enormously successful.
What was the message of that show? In a line. Summarize the...
There is no such thing as too Jewish.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Talent is talent.
Okay.
Entertainment is entertainment. And if it's good whether you're Jewish or not. And that show changed my life because it was very successful. Mm-hmm. But I ended up running away from New York. Again, I talk about it in the show. The success of Too Jewish made me even more too Jewish in the eyes of the New York theater industry. But because the show was so successful, I ended up doing 3,000 performances all over the country. And it changed my life financially and otherwise, and I moved to Florida.
And, by the way, did it secure your life?
Financially?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
No, it did for 10 years.
Okay. Have you made a living in theater?
Yes, yes.
Which is very unusual.
Oh, yes.
People don't understand it.
Oh, yes, I've been
You want to make
privileged.
a living in theater, you've got to be really good and have some luck.
5% of union members in the Professional Actors Union actually make a living. I'm very privileged.
Yes. Right now, still Jewish after all these years, runs for how long?
Till October 23rd.
Of
on
2013.
Wednesdays. Yes, of 2013. And it's only on Wednesdays from here till then at the Stage 72 at the Triad at 158 West 72nd Street, stilljewishtheshow.com. And tickets are 800-838-3006.
It's autobiographical?
Yes.
Okay.
A Meshuggah life in the theater.
Okay. And it is both, it's reminiscences of your own.
Yes.
And there's song.
It's a story of breaking through a stereotype. That's really what it is.
Yes. And do you feel I am overreaching when I say, in some way, it is an American Jewish story? It's not every American Jewish story, but it symbolizes something. For your case, it happens through theater. But there was a generation, Avi, who really lived your story in different contexts.
Yes, absolutely.
And there is a universal message in Still Jewish after all these years.
The universal message is never give up. Never give up. And I kind of, I've talked about it a little bit here. You know, the idea that all through my career, I never gave up. And even when I thought I made it, and then, you know, I talk about how, in the show, about how Charles Grodin wrote a book about his career. And he wrote something that I talk about in the show that stayed with me 20, 30 years now. He said, to make it in show business, to become truly successful in show business, all you need is 24 big breaks. So, you know, I'm almost there. But what's interesting for me, and where I get to by the end of the show, is that, you know, I ran away from New York theater because I felt that I had become so stereotyped that I no longer had the opportunity. The success of Too Jewish allowed me the financial freedom to work all over the country, But because I moved to Florida, I suddenly started getting cast in all the roles that I wanted to do in New York. So here I am playing Billy Flynn in Chicago, or, you know, Arthur Shubershevsky in Superior Donuts, or You Can't Take It With You. And so I actually do a little medley of these roles that I've gotten to play that are so not Jewish. Jacques Brel is alive and well and living in Paris. And so never give up. No matter what people try to do to you, you can persist and overcome the challenge. And that's really what Jewish, not Jewish, actor, not actor, that's ultimately the message of the show. But it's told through my personal, meshugana, crazy life in this business.
Are you worried, by the way, that Yiddish culture is going to die?
No, I don't. Yiddish culture will not die. 200 and odd years ago, there was a Jewish historian who was quoted saying the following. I don't know his name, but he was quoted saying, within 10 years, Yiddish will be dead. He's dead.
And
Yiddish is still around.
Yes.
I'm right now, although when this airs, it'll probably be done, I'm doing the all-Yiddish version of Waiting for Godot.
But it got fabulous
It's
reviews.
sold out. You cannot get a ticket. And most of the people seeing it have no concept of the Yiddish language, but they're reading the titles. And they're experiencing what I believe may be the most incredible reinterpretation of Godot since Beckett wrote it. Because Beckett didn't realize that he actually wrote the quintessential Jewish show. A bunch of guys standing around kvetching about how they're in pain and they're waiting. Who waits better than the Jews? Nobody. And it really is a Jewish show. And I've found out since that the original name of Estragon was Levi.
No.
Yes. Beckett renamed him after he wrote the first version. So he really did write that in the context of the Holocaust and World War II and the experience of the war, and I think very much in the context of his Jewish writer friends and artist friends who were with him after the war in France. And so Beckett wrote the quintessential Jewish play, but it's never been interpreted that way until now. So Yiddish lives. Yiddish will live on forever because it's too rich to die. Has it contracted substantially? Of course. Will it ever be what it was? You know, I think I would be deluding myself if I said yes, because the pre-war Yiddish world of Warsaw, Vienna, and Europe, I don't think we will ever achieve that again. I would like to hope so, but I doubt it. But so what? We will have, I mean, there are Yiddish films being made today. There are Yiddish books being written, Yiddish songs being written, Yiddish poetry, Yiddish theater. What I would like to see, hand in hand with the revival of the Yiddish language, is an expansion of the Yiddish classic world of culture being reinterpreted back for an English-speaking audience. See, that to me is the first step. If you can take the magnificence, and it's happening. For instance, I did a show called The Quarrel. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was done off-Broadway. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin wrote a version with someone else who I don't remember at the moment. I did the show in Florida. It was originally written as a novella by Chaim Grade in Yiddish, and the name was My Quarrel with Herschel Raziner. That has been reinterpreted into an English stage presentation, which I believe is magnificent. And I was very privileged to be able to play the rabbi in the show. I had a beard down to here. I mean, I was indeed the rabbi. And I actually have a beautiful moment in my show at the very end, a monologue from that, where he says, in the Torah it says that at the end of every day of creation, God looked down on what he created, and God saw that it was good, except when God created man. That is the only time in creation when God says nothing. And you know why? Because God gave man the choice to be good. Man's fate is in man's hands. We have to choose to be good, and we do have that choice. Even Hitler, Yemach Shmo, Tui, had that choice. God's ways are very hard to understand, but know that there is an explanation for everything. And every day, I pray for understanding. And that, from Yiddish to English, is a way that we can bring the Yiddish cultural world back to life, hand in hand with a revival of the Yiddish world, whether it's reinterpretations of Godot into Yiddish or reinterpretations of the classic Yiddish theater in a new modern way, or new works that are coming up, like Songs of Paradise was a mix of Yiddish and English together. I think the future is very hopeful.
You're extraordinary. You're an extraordinary gift, Avi Hoffman.
Thank you,
This has been wonderful getting to know you.
Thank you.
I hope you'll sit in that chair often.
I
look
hope
forward to
so.
seeing you
I would
on
love
stage
to.
or off stage. And when you do the Dachau film, you'll let me know.
Absolutely.
But you have been a gift in so many, many ways, and I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha, only the best for you.
It's been one of the greatest interviews I've ever had. Thank you.
Thank you
I'm
for saying that.
privileged.
to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, truly.
Thank you. My conversation with Avi Hoffman, star of Still Jewish After All These Years, a Meshuggah's Life in the Theater. If you're watching this before October 23rd, 2013, you still have a chance to see Avi in that show. Simply call 800-838-3006. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to anything Avi had to say. Please be in touch with me. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And as always, if you want to be in touch with Avi Hoffman yourself, you can do so by emailing me, and I will forward your emails on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.